Ready for summer. Good morning, everybody. My name is Lindsay Sagnet, and I'm thrilled to be here today in this magnificent company to introduce you to Diksha Basu. Her brilliant debut, The Windfall, is a heartfelt comedy of manners that explores what making it really means when you can finally have it all. Moving between the worlds of India's nouveau riche and America's elite universities, one early reviewer described The Windfall as Jane Austen in Delhi. It is written with a deft touch that belies its punch-packing exploration of upward mobility, romantic entanglements, marital power dynamics, and parental expectation. Diksha peoples her novel with unforgettable characters that all seem to be heeding Forrester's directive to only connect as they attempt to make their way in a very new world and to find the place in which they belong. The Windfall tells the story of Mr. and Mrs. Jha, who have become millionaires overnight after the sale of Mr. Jha's website. Mr. Jha believes it is no longer fitting for them to live in their crowded apartment building, so he buys a huge mansion in the Bel Air style neighborhood of Delhi, and moves his wife there despite her discomfort with her newfound status. The Jhas, who have one of the most charming marriages I've seen on the page in recent years, don't immediately fit in, and their move sets off a chain of events that rocks their son, their neighbors, new and old, and their marriage. The Windfall has just been named an Indie Next Pick for July, earned rave early reviews, and received terrific praise from David Ebershoff, Kevin Kwan, Jade Chang, and Gary Steingart. Diksha was born in Delhi and moved to DC as a teenager. The daughter of an economics professor, she herself graduated from Cornell with a degree in economics before throwing caution majorly to the wind and pursuing an acting career, first throwing of caution. Then she moved to Mumbai after graduation and spent a decade acting in Bollywood features and independent films. I'm completely outing you, I'm sorry. She then, caution again to the wind, earned her MFA from Columbia, where she now teaches writing. I hope those of you who've read The Windfall will join me in congratulating her on this engrossing and massively entertaining novel. And to those of you who have yet to meet the Jhas, I envy you your first encounter with their story and with a writer whose gifts will have you pressing The Windfall into the hands of your readers in the coming months.
Thank you so much, Lindsay. I always feel I have to apologize for the Bollywood background, but it is true. It's such a pleasure to be here today. It's also wonderful timing because I actually had a baby less than 4 weeks ago. And so 7 a.m. is a completely normal hour for the first time in my life for me to be awake, but in a very cruel joke by nature, it apparently takes adults 5 hours of uninterrupted sleep to have their brain fully function, and newborns feed every 3 hours. But this is all to say it's a real pleasure and privilege to be here this morning. In 1994, when I was 10 years old, I moved to America from New Delhi, India. I started 6th grade in this completely different world where there were no school uniforms and I had a locker. It was as if I had stepped out of my life in India and into an episode of The Wonder Years, which was my favorite television show for longer than I care to admit. I loved entering middle school in America, but I had no idea how unforgiving the social hierarchy of an American middle school could be. And there seemed to be no space in it for a young girl from Delhi. So I did what many middle schoolers who find themselves outside the social world do. I took refuge in the school library. But we all know that story, the ones who don't quite fit in at school but then discover a world in the library. It's such a lovely story, to be sure, but I feel we've heard it time and again. We're all grateful to libraries for it. I imagine that most of us in this room today are products of that story. It doesn't make me terribly special. What I want to tell you about instead is my 83-year-old grandmother who lives in New Delhi. I grew up in a lovely, average, middle-class neighborhood in Delhi, the one on which the first half of The Windfall is based. My family and I had lived there since I was 3 years old, and my grandparents lived in the building next to us. Both my parents worked, so my grandparents played the role of secondary parents. I lived half my life in our home and half my life in theirs. My grandparents had had an arranged marriage. My grandmother was 17 when she got married, and she had my mother a year later, so she was still quite young when I was growing up. Even though my grandparents' marriage was arranged, it was one of the most romantic partnerships I've ever encountered. They were best friends and they were partners in the truest sense of the word. After their children had all grown up and gone on to have their own families and lives, my grandparents had a second youth of sorts. They explored all of India, they listened to music and drank whiskey and treated themselves to the occasional imported cured meats and lived really well on their modest savings. They traveled the whole world together. My grandmother in her saris and sneakers, my grandfather in his well-ironed pants with creases that ran crisply down the leg. And that's how I always knew them, inseparable and with a zest for life that I continue to covet now. But then in 1996, my grandfather died of a massive heart attack. He died as he walked off an airplane in transit at London Heathrow on his way from New York City back home to New Delhi. He and my grandmother had been traveling in the United States for 6 weeks. At Heathrow, my grandfather walked off the gangway and into the main terminal. He told my grandmother something didn't quite feel right and dropped the bag he was holding and fell to his knees and then his hands and then the floor. And my grandmother started screaming, and Heathrow officials and medics came rushing, but he died right then, quickly and, I hope, as painlessly as possible. My mother and her sisters went to London immediately to be by my grandmother's side and to arrange for my grandfather's body to be brought home to Delhi. In India, amongst Hindus, the body is always brought home before the cremation so that the soul can be released in familiar surroundings. A few days later, I was there when my grandmother returned to Delhi, leaning against her daughters, looking decades older than she had just 2 months ago. Her hair, which had always been black, was suddenly a shock of white. She returned to the home she shared with my grandfather, the only life she'd ever known, and she returned to it all alone. We no longer lived next door at this point. Even though we happened to be in India when this happened, my immediate family had by now moved to upstate New York, and my grandmother had to continue life alone. She didn't want to come and live with us or any of her other daughters. Even then, she said she wanted to live her own life and be surrounded by the memories of my grandfather. Since then, my grandmother has found a different kind of home and community in the local library. She lives in a housing complex, and some of the women got together and petitioned the board to let them use one of the community rooms to set up a library for the residents, and my grandmother immersed herself in helping to set this up and run it. She spends all her evenings there. Even if we're visiting her, she refuses to miss an evening. This library relies on donations to run, so they have magazines from years ago on rotation. And when I go to visit my grandmother now, she fills me in on stories that were published in Reader's Digest 4 years ago. And she guzzles books. My grandmother, who grew up knowing only Marathi, now tears through thick novels in Marathi, Gujarati, English, and Hindi. She found a community and a life that helped fill some of the spaces that were left empty after my grandfather's death. She also, unfortunately, has started gossiping more than she ever used to before. But like all good grandmothers, she defends her family to the bone while dissecting the failures of other families in great detail. She'll shake her head about the neighbor's daughter who lives in sin with her white boyfriend in Bangalore, while I, who did the exact same thing with my white boyfriend, now husband, in Mumbai, will be defended. And if the other women dare criticize my life choices, they will not be spared by my grandmother. And nor will her neighbor, Mr. Bose, when my grandmother heard rumors that he was spending every evening away from his wife and with the woman in the local market who runs a small cake shop. And all the women of this library turned detectives for a few weeks when a young couple from Chennai moved in and the wife was giving dance lessons from her living room. One of the women in the library put it into everyone's heads that the wife was probably running a brothel. She absolutely was not. It kept the women occupied for quite a while. And this is the India I write about in The Windfall. Not my grandmother, but the stories of everyday India, which since the mid-1990s often includes sudden, extravagant leaps in income. Some families surged into extreme wealth, while many stayed exactly where they were and watched their neighbors start shopping in fancy glass-walled malls instead of the local street markets, start drinking imported wine instead of local rum, and vacationing on the beaches of southern France instead of the beaches of Goa. I don't write about how the poor slum kids smile despite their poverty. And I also don't write about the ashrams and hennaed hands and marigold flowers and multicolored fabrics. I don't write about the displaced Indian diaspora and the immigrants trying to find their place in America. That has all been done, and it's been done very well before me. I write about the India I grew up in and know well, the day-to-day lives of average Indians. The Windfall is deeply rooted in New Delhi, and the city certainly serves as a character in the book, but I think and I hope at the core of this book is something universal. I hope readers see some of their own insecurities and struggles and concerns no matter where they're from. Circumstances may be dictated by borders, but basic humanity isn't. And I hope you and other readers will also laugh while reading this. We all need to laugh in this increasingly divided world where we're being asked to fear the outsider and the unknown. It's important to remember that the unknown is usually just more funny than frightening. And I'll end just by telling you about what my grandmother thinks about my book. She was visiting my parents here in New York when I gave it to her to read a few months ago. The day she finished reading it, I went over to my parents' house to find out what she thought about it. I was wearing a dress that hit above the knee. My grandmother saw me and said, good job. The book is quite good, but why aren't you wearing pants under your top?" So, thank you so much for taking the time to... I hope you enjoy reading the novel, and I hope you consider recommending it to your readers.